Hi, everyone. I'm going to be your host online tonight. Denise is also going to be helping me here as well. Just a reminder to make sure that you are on mute. And if you turn your videos off, that just helps us with bandwidth as well, too.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Welcome everyone to the first hybrid meeting of Nature Guelph. First time we've been back live in 2 years. Pretty small crowd on this side, but lots of you on Zoom, so I hope you can hear all well. We acknowledge that we're meeting on the ancestral lands of several First Nations. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer our respect to our First Nation, Métis, and Inuit neighbors as we strive to strengthen our relationships with them. Indigenous women have been described as facing a double burden, that of being discriminated against as women and for being Indigenous. The Indian Act disrupted the matrilineal system of many First Nations, removing women from band government and leading to the loss of status for many. Indigenous women continue to be overrepresented in murdered and missing women in Canada. And this is the week of International Women's Day, so we can think of the Indigenous women of Canada. Nature Guelph connects people with nature and inspires them to celebrate and protect it. We do this through both education and action, our meetings like this one, and our conservation project, citizen science, and advocacy. Your membership matters. If we are entirely volunteer run and the money you provide your membership funds these meetings, it also gives us a greater voice for advocacy. If you have not joined and purchased your membership, please do so. Nature Guelph provides an opportunity for donors to direct where they'd like to share their charitable dollars. We have a general fund, a youth education fund, and a conservation and land stewardship fund. You can donate through Canada Helps. I'd like to welcome everyone, a small crowd here and the bigger crowd on Zoom. And again, the event is free, but we always welcome donations. We need some volunteers at Nature Guelph. We're looking for writers and copy editors, a social media manager, our Nature Guelph Birdwing and outdoor events leaders, and someone who was interested in programming the indoor meetings like this one. This is your club. Please let us know if there's anything you'd like done with the club, any ideas you have, or any volunteering you'd like to do. We have activities you can involve with. We still have the Nature Guelph YouTube channel running, and today's presentation will be up on that shortly. You can, when you're out walking, take 2 items of garbage from the watershed, post a picture of that onto the Take 2 watershed cleanup. You can share your photos on the Guelph Nature Community Facebook group and post questions, ask for identification, and just share your nature activities. The events coming up next week, next Wednesday, is Outstanding Ontario Native Shrubs with Kevin Cavanaugh. That's on Zoom. You'll have to register for that. We have Tales and Trails on March 20th. It's a Sunday afternoon. Jennifer Blender will be taking children through a story and then a travel through the nature, a maple bush, and then they'll be eating some maple syrup. You can registration for that as well. There's a social hike from the Joseph Wolfen Park to the Woolly Pub. Social hikes are for adults. We do a little hike and then we stop at a pub for refreshments. Again, you need to register in advance for that. Birdwing is April 7th, and the first half of the meeting is Wellington Notable Birds, where you can share your notable birds sightings. And then the presentation is Bean Hockey with Dr. Janet Eng, a wildlife biologist. And the speaker series, this series next month will be how landscape modifications impact birds and squirrels. So for those of you who are at home, I want you to mute your microphones, turn off your video, and you can post questions to chat.
In December 2019, Overrun was longlisted for the 2020 RBC Charles Taylor Prize. His work has appeared in the Walrus, the Globe and Mail, and this magazine, amongst many others. And he holds a master's degree in geography from the University of Toronto and a master's of fine arts and creative nonfiction from the University of King's College in Halifax. And Andrew sat on the board of Ontario Nature, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, from 2015 to 2019, and currently lives in Toronto with his wife and daughter. And I'm going to hand it over to Andrew now.
How about now? Is that better for everyone at home? Yay, okay, perfect. Yes, yay, there it is. There's the round of applause. Again, thank you all so much for coming out here and online. And I guess I say, welcome back. I know that this has been really tricky for groups like this, is like to be able to make this kind of like hybrid engagement work, but it's been amazing to see the resilience that groups like yours and others have had to be able to continue doing what you do and what you love and what's important despite all of these really trying times. And as I mentioned a moment ago, thank you to Peter for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here. So based on some of your upcoming speaker series, I might be doing something a little bit different tonight than some of your other speakers might, which I think is maybe one of the reasons why Peter wanted to have me, because I wrote a book called Overrun, Dispatches from the Asian Carp Crisis, that was taking a look at this very pressing environmental concern that's been going on over the past 5 or 6 decades at this point. But it's one that's been getting a lot of attention in the past decade or so. But I still thought that there was a really fascinating story there, and I think that you'll all find this interesting as well. So we'll move through. Here we go. Is that gonna work? Doing it earlier. Let me turn that off and we'll try that one again. I believe it's starting from this one here, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of pictures to go through. Yeah, but it's still not clicking through, unfortunately. So I might have to pop over and hit some buttons. No, unfortunately, when we're tapping on the screen, it's not responding. It's strange. Oh, there we go. Is it working now? Does it work here now? Perfect. Wonderful. So when we're talking about Asian carp, this is the image that comes to mind for most people. And this is a photo that was likely taken by the US Fish and Wildlife Service, probably over the past decade or so, likely from the Illinois River heading towards Chicago. It was like where you would end up actually finding the vast majority of fish this size. And there's one other classic image of Asian carp that most people would be familiar with when they think about this problem. And it's this. So what you're seeing here is an explosion of silver carp that are leaping out of probably like a smaller tributary of the Illinois River. They're responding to electroshocks, which are coming from the boat here, which you can see is probably, again, US Fish and Wildlife Service or Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And it's a fight or flight mechanism. These fish are feeling this jolt in the water, and their response is to that is to leap out of the water until the terror basically subsides in a lot of cases. But one of the interesting things I really found fascinating about Asian carp is that these kinds of images were really what drew a lot of modern audiences into thinking about this problem, because there aren't really native species in North America who are going to have that kind of response and are going to have that kind of response en masse. This was the first clear sign for most people that something was going terribly wrong in our rivers. So to talk to you really briefly about what went into writing Overrun before I dive into the background of the story here, I was about 5.5 years worth of research and writing. I visited 12 states and provinces, conducted about 8 dozen interviews, had 1 child along the way, which thankfully didn't disrupt the process of researching and writing too much. But the research material, and it's my goal with the book was to make sure that there was a lot of material that was covered, but I wanted it to be readable. I didn't want people to feel that this was like too sciencey or too jargony. The whole goal from the beginning was to have this be something that someone was going to be able to sit down and actually find like shocking or riveting in some way. So when a reviewer compared it to like a Kurt Vonnegut story, that was the one I told my publisher, well, we have to put that one on the back. It was like, because I'm probably only going to be compared to Kurt Vonnegut once in my life. And if someone does that unprompted, it was like, then I absolutely want to tell everyone about it. So that was what I was going for. But within this, there's a lot of archival materials, academic articles, newspapers, but there's also like a wide breadth of locations, because my other goal really was to write for the senses. I wanted you to be in those boats with me. I wanted you to be in that fish processing plant. I wanted you to be in the laboratories, but also the bars and the cafes and the restaurants where people are engaging with this fish in a variety of ways. I don't know whether I'll get to it in this talk, but to give you an example of this, in the fish processing plant, I felt it was really important to include in one of the later chapters that as I was interviewing one of my research subjects, he led me into part of the fish processing plant where they were taking all the scraps of Asian carp that no one wanted to eat, and they were turning them into fertilizer. And I was surrounded by these like 20-gallon drums of fish fertilizer. And I realized as I was talking with this man that I was about to be sick. Like I could feel my stomach churning. And I remember thinking to myself as I had my recorder out listening to him, I remember telling myself, Andrew, you need to get out of here, because if you don't, you're going to be ill. And I really don't think it's a good idea for you to throw up on an interview subject. And so in my brain, I'm like, how do I do this? So very slowly with my recorder up, I started walking backwards towards the exit. And he did this interesting thing where he sort of noticed that I was moving away and then kind of sort of followed me out of the building. And then only later told me when I think he noticed what I had done, which is he pointed out he had been doing this for 5-6 years at that point. And at this, he didn't even notice the smell anymore. But I think he could tell that I was starting to turn a little green. And those were the details that I really wanted to be able to include, because I think they're a really important part of this story that is often not included when we talk about it. So here's a laboratory at the University of Notre Dame in Illinois, where some fish researchers were working on PCR analysis. This is down in Arkansas, where you're seeing different, these are called like the raceways, where you have fish that are being hatched there for distribution and sale around the country. These are fish eggs that for grass carp that are being spawned down in Arkansas as well for sale. And we'll explain why. There are some versions of Asian carp that are actually being still to this day like sold around the United States. This is a version of it up here where it's been smoked, where you can like pull it off the bone. This was the first encounter I had with trying Asian carp from some that I had purchased in Thompson, Illinois. These are the bones in the jaw of black carp. And you can see they have these amazing sets of molars that they are using to be able to crunch freshwater mollusks, which is their primary diet. Those, for reference for people at home who might be able to see, those teeth are probably about like the size of my thumb. They're massive. And this is my arm after spending a day with some commercial fishermen on the Illinois River, where we were hauling in, I think that day they estimated we hauled in about 10,000 pounds of the fish in a single day around Ottawa, Illinois. This was about 4 years ago or so. And you just got so coated in fish like guts and slime and feces that by the end of the day, it had so caked on to my skin and my jacket and my hat that my wife subsequently made me throw out the hat and the jacket that I was wearing, because after washing them again and again and again, there were some smells that just weren't going to come out, and that was one of them. So what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about Asian carp? And I think it's really important to understand that this is an umbrella term. So Asian carp now are this monolith. It was like, but to a lot of the early fish researchers who were working with these species, they were all very different. They fit like a different niche in ecosystems that they were being introduced to. So their range is in northern China, and they were introduced to North America over about 2 decades, between 1963 and 1984. And what's really important to note is the different foods that they're going to consume, which is why they were brought over in these different ways. You have grass carp were the first ones. They're third from the bottom. They're aquatic plant eaters. And by all accounts, they are one of the most voracious aquatic plant eaters in the world, which is one of the main reasons why they have been cultured throughout the world for hundreds and hundreds of years, simply because if you have waterways that you need to keep clear of aquatic weeds, they are your best biological control option, hands down. They have two closely related cousins in bighead and silver carp, which are the top two that you see here. These two species, just for your own reference, they are so closely related that they have been able to interbreed and produce viable offspring. So you can have hybrid. So very often you'll see in some literature, if they're referring to big-headed carp, that specifically would be either like bighead or silver or a hybrid of the two of them together. These are filter feeders. So these are fish that are moving through waterways with their mouths open and are capable of consuming upwards in some cases of 20% of their body weight in a given day, which is a problem when you have fish that are average around 20 to 40 pounds, but have been found in the record to reach about 140 pounds. Admittedly, those 140-pound fish are outliers, but if you remember the slide that I showed you at the beginning of that big vat of those fish, those were the size, and those were about 25, 30 pounds on average that we were pulling out. So you imagine fish that were consuming such huge amounts of phyto and zooplankton in the water column, which is essentially like the backbone of most aquatic ecosystems in terms of food that other fish were going to be consuming. Where do we find them now in North America? Well, the Gulf Coast, to the Great Lakes, along the Mississippi River, along the Atlantic coast. I'm sorry for the grainy image there, but this should give you some idea. This is grass carp in particular, and this gives you some idea of their spread. Some of that spread has been what has happened when the fish have just been released into local waterways. So you can see here, this is following the Mississippi River. So a lot of what you're seeing here is spread throughout the Mississippi River basin and its tributaries. But then you have places up here, like down in Florida, for example, where a lot of this was intentional early stocking of these fish, which is what we're going to talk about today in my discussion. So today, as I mentioned, I want to talk with you about how Asian carp arrived in North America. And as I say, the story we often hear, I'm loath to call it a lie, but it is a very thin history because I think that the truth is actually far more fascinating. And it has its roots in a very unlikely source. And I'm going to leave you suspended there for one moment because I realized I don't have my book and I was going to do a reading. So give me one moment while I grab that. And that unlikely source is Rachel Carson. It was a spring without voices, Carson wrote. Mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound. Only silence lay over the fields. Because from its hopeful beginnings, the decade of the 1960s would end in flames. 1969 saw rivers in Ohio and Michigan literally ablaze. Oil slicks on the Cuyahoga River burned for the second time in less than 20 years as cities prolonged the ageless tradition of confusing urban rivers with cheap sewer systems. Burning rivers was a disturbingly regular occurrence in heavily industrialized Rust Belt cities like Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago. But in the year that 400,000 people flocked to White Lake, New York for 3 days of peace and music at Woodstock, and as the US military personnel in Vietnam peaked at over 500,000 Americans, the image of oil-slicked rivers engulfed in flames, choked with rafts of human feces, made plain how desperate America's environmental plight had become. An unknown but oft-quoted environmental activist stated bluntly at the time that when rivers are on fire, you know things are bad. But this was the time of better living through chemistry. And a lot of this came home. It was like thanks to DDT in particular, which became the poster child for a lot of this, for the success that it had in the Second World War, keeping largely US servicemen safe in the Pacific theater and as they fought their way up the Italian peninsula, like towards mainland Europe. DDT was in many respects like a miracle chemical in being able to prevent typhus in particular from infecting servicemen. And so it found this very receptive audience when it came home. There were many people who had suggested somehow that actually the single most important thing to come out of World War II was something like DDT and how miraculous it was in being able to kill pests and how it seemingly had no impact on people. So then in the immediate post-war years, this is what you see. You have groups of people at a community pool who are gathered here as someone is spraying them with DDT. About 15, 16 years ago, when I met my mother-in-law for the first time, she grew up in a small town in Nova Scotia. And I remember her telling me a story of her and her younger brother hopping on their bikes anytime the DDT trucks came into town, as they would basically do this. They would drive down Main Street with the hoses out on either side, and they were spraying the neighborhood to be able to rid it of these pests that were infesting pantries that were really upsetting for a lot of like homeowners at the time. And she would say that it was basically a source of great excitement. Anytime the DDT truck came through town, you always wanted to be one of the first kids on your bike so that you could be riding through this cloud that came behind because it felt like you were in a movie. But of course, the success that DDT had in ridding pantries of unwanted pests, of course, as we well know, had a lot of impacts throughout the food chain. It bioaccumulating in a lot of ways. And these were the results. But I didn't think, we did it in Winnipeg too, running behind the fog machine. So it's fascinating. I think a lot of people have had experiences like this. I mean, I'll be honest, when I set out to write this book, I was familiar with Rachel Carson. I had not read Silent Spring at that point. I also was not under the impression that it was going to factor into this story as much as it did. And I think it's something that surprised a lot of people when I started doing these talks. This connection between Asian carp and their introduction and Rachel Carson seemed to elude a lot of people. And so that's why I've started giving a lot of my talks based on this. I think it actually helps illuminate their history here the most. So I briefly want to read something from the book where the idea of Rachel Carson was first mentioned to me and the very unlikely sources that it came from when I was meeting with resource workers down in Arkansas, people who were the last people, if I'm honest about my own biases, the last people in the world I thought were going to be talking to me about Rachel Carson in relation to how they did their work and why. So as our meeting concluded, Mike Freeze handed me a water-stained banker's box, overflowing with musty fish reports, files, and photos dating back to the 1960s. That night, I dissected the documents, flicking away the exoskeletons of long dead beetles trapped between Arkansas Game and Fish Commission reports. Suddenly, it occurred to me why talk of Rachel Carson stuck in my throat. Because Mike Freeze wasn't the first to invoke Silent Spring. Another colleague of his, Drew Mitchell, had told me much the same. I reviewed my interview notes. Mitchell: throughout the 1940s and 50s, there was tremendous chemical usage, DDT being the poster child. And then there became many scares in the public and people became very concerned about it biologically. A book arose from this that's really a trendsetter, a wonderfully written book by Rachel Carson. She suggests the use of biological control to get away from chemical controls, even the importation of biological controls, whatever we can do to lower chemical usage. And this was a huge trend. Her book came out in 1962, and in 1963, grass carp were first brought in by the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Me. Hold on a sec. Was this actually a driving force behind their decision? Mitchell: absolutely. Because some people say, well, US Fish and Wildlife Service was really screwed up, but no. They were following what they thought was good, appropriate, sound advice. Concern over chemicals so far outweighed it that they didn't worry about it. Fish and Wildlife were dealing with how do we lower chemical use? And these grass carp, they gave them something. The impact of Silent Spring in creating a social mindset where importing an exotic fish for biological control of aquatic weeds seemed rational is often overlooked in Asian Carp's American Odyssey. Despite its current iteration as a harbinger of ecological doom, invasive carp fits snugly into an environmental ethos that evolved throughout the 1960s. Turning a blind eye to the high cost of prolonged chemical use, both economic and environmental, became increasingly arduous after Carson exposed the chemical industrial complex's dark underbelly. Using grass carp was a compelling new course of action. And as Mitchell told me, these grass carp, they gave them something. And so inspired by this, curious wildlife officials went searching for biological solutions. And so that's where we'll pick up. Because there is also the unlikely influence of this man, Jim Malone. Because it was around 1963 that someone from the United Nations, from the Agriculture Food Organization, had recommended to America that in order to deal with their problem with aquatic weeds, that they import grass carp to be able to deal with those. But he also encouraged the men that he was speaking with, because at this time in America, they were almost exclusively men who were working in fisheries, that before they do something like import grass carp to be able to deal with this problem, that they take their time, that they study the effects of what grass carp might do if they were released or stocked into open or closed waters, because we know escapes are possible, and we know that any biological species is not respecting political borders, that they do their research and they find a way to be able to do that properly. And they waited about 3 months. And then they determined that, yes, we should move ahead with this. But around this time, you had this man, Jim Malone, who was living in Lone Oak County in Arkansas, just a little bit south and to the east of Little Rock. And there's Jim's father, who had purchased this small plot of land, and it had this fee fishing lake. And his father had given him this land to basically say that he was able to do what he wanted with it. The idea was that they were going to stock it, and people who wanted to come and fish could pay him a couple bucks and be able to fish out for the day. But eventually, Jim realized that that wasn't going to be a way for him to make a living. And so he planted his field with rice. And unfortunately, around this time, there was an errant crop duster that flew low and destroyed his rice crop. And so he had to start again. But around this time, he had also heard about the importation of grass carp. And it was something that he was really curious about. And he thought that he might give it a try. And so to give you a sense of what these fish farms look like, again, very, very low, very, very sparse to the ground. All these came out of the archives down at the University of Central Arkansas. And then interesting, when you're doing archival research, you end up stumbling across these things that are the diamonds in the rough in a lot of cases. And this is one of them. This is the packing slip that Jim Malone sent to Taiwan in order to be able to bring back the first shipment, the first private purchase shipment of grass carp in American history. And there in the archives was the packing slip. And so when these fish arrived, they're also sometimes referred to as white ammer, on account of the Amur River Basin in Russia and China is their home range. So you will often see them called white ammer as well. So he brought these fish over with the hope that he was going to be able to raise them, because he knew that there was going to be this big interest. And who was buying fish at this point to use them for biological control? Well, you have like massive farm operations in California and in Florida who had irrigation canals that were going between citrus groves. But if you got an invasive plant that was running wild in those irrigation canals, it was virtually impossible to be able to actually like water your crops. So whether you're thinking like oranges in Florida, whether you're thinking almond groves in California, there was a huge need for this. And as I read from the book a moment ago, starting in the early 1960s, it became increasingly clear that the way that most resource managers, but also people who ran golf courses, or people who had were in charge of keeping like cooling ponds for power plants clear of weeds, suddenly everyone was realizing that the indiscriminate dumping of chemicals was actually doing far more damage than people realized. So what exactly were they going to do about that? Well, they started looking around for biological controls, precisely like Asian carp, grass carp in particular, to be able to come and clear some of those weeds. Here's just a few other photos, which I think is interesting here. I titled one of the chapters in the book Ecology's Helper, because Jim Malone, more than any other private individual, sort of became the public face of people who were supporting the purchase and the use of grass carp in North America. Here was another fun photo from the archives. It's his wife with Bob Hope. They became, in this small world of aquaculture in the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s, they became something of a celebrity. But the interesting thing about the fish in particular was that the early reception was tremendous. You had a lot of these newspaper reports were referring to them as, superfish. This was very common, very glowing reviews as people realized these fish were the real deal. Any of the early tests that were done, studies that were run at Auburn University, or by Fish and Wildlife Service as well, found that when you release these fish, they were miracle fish when it came to cleaning weeds. There were some troubling reports at the time, however, that if you did overstock them, these fish behaved as most starving animals would, and they became a little desperate. And so there were occasionally reports of overstocked grass carp leaping from the water to be able to grab onto plant matter along like the banks of rivers or streams where they were stocked in order to be able to pull any organic matter down to have something to eat. But then slowly but surely, conservationists entered the conversation. And it wasn't just the resource officials who were saying, these fish are going to be amazing. We will be able to rear them and sell them to, again, golf course ponds, irrigation districts, anyone who needs to be able to control these fish, we will be able to provide that. Suddenly, the science caught up with that to say, well, hold on, maybe they're really good at what it is that they're doing, but have we actually stopped to consider what impact there will be if you release fish in one state, like Arkansas, for example, that has very direct ties via open waters to the Mississippi River system, with the Mississippi River system giving it access to vast swaths of not only America, but into the Great Lakes system as well. These conversations slowly caught up, which is why you then end up seeing these new fights were happening about disagreements about grass carp. Some people saying the benefits are going to outweigh the drawbacks, I guarantee it. While other people were saying, okay, maybe we want to continue using them, but that there was a lot of controversy. And this slowly built up over the 1970s. I also love these images, which is why I wanted to be able to include them as well. And it wasn't just, and to be clear, it wasn't just academic papers that were having these conversations. That was where it began. But you could really tell that it was starting to enter the zeitgeist when you started seeing these stories appear in the Wall Street Journal and in major newspapers in Ohio and Florida, in Tennessee, and Texas, and Arkansas. So it wasn't confined to academia. It spilled over into the mainstream media as people started having these conversations about, well, wait a minute, where are these fish now, and how have they spread? So unfortunately, you can't see it there, but I'll say before I go on, I want to talk a little bit more about this unexpected yet important interlude about catfish farming involving this man, Homer Buck. And so we've talked about grass carp up until this point and their spread and how it is that they were released. But interestingly enough, we haven't mentioned anything much about bighead or silver carp, because they were sort of in the background of a lot of this at the beginning, until initially in the early 1970s, someone had the idea that they might be incredibly useful in catfish farming. And the reason why is because catfish are fed, or at least they were at the time, like this very high protein diet. And so there was a lot of excrement that they produced, which led to a lot of algal blooms in the ponds where they were kept. And so catfish farming, which was big, big business in Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana at the time, it still is. Catfish farmers were looking about for some kind of solution because they didn't want to dump chemicals in the ponds where their catfish were kept, because it could hurt the catfish, which was going to cut into their profit. And so they too were looking around for a biological control option. And it was around this time that someone had suggested, well, you know, grass carp that we brought over to be able to clear out the irrigation canals and the cooling ponds of power plants. Well, actually, in a lot of ways, they have these cousins that are cultured alongside them quite nicely in China at the time and many other places around the world, in bighead and silver carp, that are filter feeders. And we actually think that they would do a really good job if you cultured them alongside catfish. When they can clean up with all those algal blooms, deal with those quite nicely, but they're not actually going to compete in any way with your catfish. And then come harvest time, you can separate them, do what you want with the Asian carp, and you can sell your catfish for a tidy profit. And so Homer Buck was one of the first to really propose this idea. You can also see that he's working here. Anyone can see what these are behind him in this pen? They're pigs. And so he's built this contraption. He worked in Kinmundy, Illinois. And he's built this contraption. You can see that it's kind of on stilts over top of a waterway. And he has these pigs inside of it. And his whole idea was, can we raise bighead and silver carp on nothing but, as he put it, hog manure and sunshine? And then the idea was that if we can raise them on nothing but hog manure and sunshine, and they have a benefit to catfish farmers, then maybe we can actually find a pretty decent use for them in North America, because we're raising animals out of nothing in a lot of ways. And then you have all of this leftover fish protein that they assumed at the time you might be able to sell either for animal feed or for pet feed or for humans as well. And so based on this idea, they introduced them for catfish farming. And it went about as horribly as you might expect. I'm going to tell you that it went. Simply because we talked earlier about how big these fish get. 2, 3, 4 times larger in most cases on average than catfish are going to get. And so the catfish farmers who bought these fish, stock them in their lagoons, was like, we're using them, growing them alongside their catfish. Come harvest time, absolutely hated Asian carp. It was like grass carp or bighead and silver in particular when they were harvesting, because these fish would thrash and fight so violently at harvest time that not only were the farmers themselves getting injured, but the fish were thrashing so violently that they were actually killing the catfish. So they did not endear themselves to catfish farmers. But the problem was, at that point, the fish were already here. State resource agencies had already invested in bringing those over. Many individual fish farmers had already spent money bringing those fish over after they had brought over grass carp a decade earlier. Now suddenly you have these fish and you're trying to figure out, well, I've already sunk a lot of money into this. What am I going to do with them? How do I pivot in some way? But then something really remarkable happened. And that was the fact that the Clean Water Act became law in 1972. And while you don't need to be like an expert in the Clean Water Act, it was like essentially one of the main points that it made, as I write here, was that it essentially codified into law something that I think was blindingly obvious, which is that dumping raw sewage into any hapless waterway that happens to be nearby was a remarkably dumb idea. But in a nutshell, that's what most states had done. You had small counties in a lot of ways throughout America who did not have the tax base to be able to build up big stormwater infrastructure. And so basically the process at the time was you'd flush your toilet, it would end up at the local sewage treatment plant, they would filter out the solids, and everything else would just be dumped into the local waterway. But it turns out that in this journey I had in researching the book, finding out as well that in addition to something like Rachel Carson and the impact that her advocating for biological control, which led many people to turn to grass carp, the Clean Water Act, in many respects, also led in a lot of cases to a potential new life for bighead and silver carp. And it gave them a new lease on life precisely at the time when their numbers were small enough that we might have been able to get a handle on it and stop the problem from getting worse. But here's what happened. It all sort of came down to this man. His name is Scott Henderson. He's still alive. I tracked him down a number of years ago, had a wonderful interview with him in his home in Arkansas. He worked at the time for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. And in the early 1970s, he was a rookie fisheries biologist that just started. He rose up through the ranks and eventually in the 2000s actually led the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission for many years. But one of his first tasks after joining was basically being told by his superiors, we have all of these fish, these bighead and silver carp that are sort of kicking around, and we have to figure out something to do with them. So he put together a grant proposal that was submitted to the Environmental Protection Agency and basically said, we have some of these, they were also referred to as Chinese carps sometimes. We have these Chinese carps, bighead and silver, stocked here in Arkansas. Do you have some money that you can give us to be able to run an experiment to see whether these fish would be able to help deal with a problem that the Clean Water Act had created? Because essentially the Clean Water Act said, all those counties that were filtering out solids and dumping the rest, you can't do that anymore. So you need to build like better water filtration systems like for your stormwater and your wastewater. Well, most counties couldn't do that. And so they were desperately scrambling to find an alternative. And the EPA remembered that they actually had these fish that they knew from the experimenting catfish farm were actually quite amazing at filtering out excess algae, the exact kind of algal blooms that you would find in sewage lagoons where you have aerobic digestion that's going on. So Scott Henderson's job was to say, can we run a program and test whether these fish are actually going to be able to do what we're talking about and be able to clean out these sewage lagoons? Because the EPA is telling like small counties across America, you have to do something about this. You have a finite amount of time, and then we're going to start fining you. So how are you going to be able to clean up your sewage instead of dumping it in the river, which would now be in violation of the Clean Water Act? And so people like Jim Malone and others who were raising fish around that time suddenly were inundated with phone calls saying, do you have these fish that the EPA is talking about? And we want to buy them. And so all of a sudden, business for Malone took off as people were desperately buying up all the big heads and silver carp that he could like raise essentially because they needed them to stock in their lagoons. But the problem was that no one really knew whether that would work as effectively as they wanted. They had some of the catfish studies, but it was all really anecdotal. Suddenly you want to have these fish be responsible for cleaning up the sewage of towns of 5, 10, 15, 20,000 in rural areas. you need to know that they can do it. So Scott Henderson received about $90,000 from the Environmental Protection Agency to run a pilot program at a hospital in Benton, Arkansas, that served about 2,000 patients and staff. And so he used that money from the EPA to be able to stock the fish, it was predominantly silvers, but also bigheads, in their lagoons, to be able to see, will they clean them in the way that the EPA is telling people that they will. But while he was dealing with Washington, he was also smart enough to get a grant from a sport fisheries bureau there for an additional $17,000 to be able to run another test to say, while we're also growing these fish, can we inspect them, analyze them afterwards to be able to see how contaminated they become after living their lives eating nothing but the algae produced in the aerobic digestion process when it's breaking down human sewage. Would people want to eat fish that have been raised on nothing but human waste? And Washington agreed, and they sent him again just over $17,000 to be able to run that test, to be able to see. And fascinatingly, for the results from both studies were more positive than Henderson could ever have hoped for. It turns out that when he ran his studies, it was all of the tests that they were running to be able to determine fecal coliform levels, BOD5 levels, everything was incredibly low. You would assume that this fish would just be riddled with mercury and other toxins, and it wasn't. It was a surprisingly clean and healthy fish, even when it had been fed nothing but human feces. They also looked at how effective they were able to clean up the algae that was in those ponds, and it turns out that these fish were, as advertised, incredible at cleaning up these sewage lagoons. So heading into the early 1980s, I think I have this here, yeah. These are some of the things I found in the archives as well. This is Scott Henderson, research biologist. These were some of the original documents that he drafted and sent to Washington. It was in the late 1970s to be able to provide status updates to the EPA about what was going on and how effective it was going. And as I say, it turns out it was incredibly effective. He did some back of the napkin math at the end of the pilot project and found that not only would this pay for itself in terms of stocking these fish, but, he added, if they were able to find willing buyers for the fish that they raised for pet food or as fertilizer, they would basically be able to break even, and it would be, and if they could find someone who was willing to purchase them for human consumption, small counties could actually stand to make a profit, because there was the input, unlike with catfish, which with their high protein diet, the input was waste. It was kind of a miracle in a lot of ways, and it was amazing when I spoke with Scott Henderson. We're talking decades later. He was running this in the late 1970s. He was still wistful over the phone when I spoke with him a few years ago when I was researching the book, genuinely feeling to this day that the only thing that prevented this from happening really was the yuck factor in a lot of ways, that because the whole thing really hinged on finding markets for human consumption and that people couldn't make that mental leap in a lot of ways, that it was essentially dead in the water. But I'm going to pop back for a second. So what happened? I mean, clearly those counties didn't stock those fish, but what happened was Ronald Reagan was elected. Morning in America arrived, and with it came new heads for the Environmental Protection Agency and Reagan's own zeal for slashing budgets. And what he ended up doing in a lot of ways, he and Ann Gorsuch, who is the mother, coincidentally, of the US Supreme Court Justice now, Neil Gorsuch, bragged in a lot of ways about cutting the budget, or cutting the list of Environmental Protection Act regulations from half a foot to half an inch. And what ended up happening was Scott Henderson put his whole package together, and he sent that into the Environmental Protection Agency's office to say, here it is. Here's the data we've been waiting for. Let's move forward with this. This is a great idea. And he sent it into Washington, and he waited and waited and waited, and no one got back to him. And he finally put in a call to say, what's going on? We're waiting here, and you've got small counties across America who are waiting to get the results of this. And essentially the reply was, we will be suspending all work with Asian carp at this point. Thank you for your diligence and for your report, but we're not interested. And Henderson seemed to be really crestfallen about this. I had to ask, I was so what happened with all of those fish that you had stocked in this hospital lagoon in Benton, Arkansas? And he assures me that they were all destroyed. And I believe him. But the fascinating thing is that he was not the only one who was working with these fish at the time. But what happens if you're a private, like small scale fish farmer, and you have these fish that you have invested in, hoping against hope that because the government is now saying people should buy them, that it's a boom that's going to take off? What happens when the bottom falls out? Well, now you're left holding the bag, and you have this investment that needs upkeep and more expenses, but you know that there's no market for it anymore. So some people, I believe, were very diligent, such as Scott Henderson, and destroyed the fish that they had in their care. But I don't believe that everyone was as respectful and as aware as Scott Henderson was. And so the easiest thing to do in a lot of cases, which is what we now know to be the case, was that there were many fish farmers at that time, having received the call from on high, and the high levels of the federal government to take these fish on, were given no directive in terms of what they should do with them now. And so many probably did the easy thing, which was simply lift the screens that separated their lagoon from open waterways. And the easiest way to be able to flush them out was essentially to pull the plug. And those fish then were able to make their way from these private lagoons into small streams. And those streams led to rivers, and those rivers led to bigger rivers. As we know, continental hydrology works. And this is how we now find ourselves with silvers and big heads the size of what we saw earlier at the gates of the Great Lakes. And so one of the central myths that I really set out to bust in a lot of cases with writing Overrun was that the central story behind them, as I mentioned, which I said off the top was not a lie, but was really thin history, is that essentially there were some catfish farmers who bought them and then didn't know what to do with the fish afterwards. And when that went belly up, they threw them into local waterways, and that was the end of it. And there are some facets to this, it was like that are true, but it ignores like the complicity of high levels of state governments and the federal government in the United States, but also these federal agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service, but also universities like Auburn and Memphis State and many, many others, all the way up to the United Nations that were engaged in this process. And up until that point, you had reams of respected scientific documents based on sound science that said, these fish are worth introducing, they are worth using, and we believe that the result or the negative impacts will be minimal. So I really wanted to be able to tell this story that was going to be able to certainly not exonerate anyone. That's not my job so much as my job, I felt in this case, was to go and find it and tell a lot of these stories to be able to say that the history, what you're told in a lot of these cases, is not only like half the story, far from it, but that the truth, as I attempted to write it, actually was far more fascinating. So why are we worried about Asian carp? Well, some reasons here, as I say, how big they grow, how often they spawn, how quickly they spread, impacts on native species, destruction of wetlands. It's a very lengthy list. Yeah. So people might also wonder, when we're talking about the threat that they pose to the Great Lakes, I'll mention this very briefly, how exactly would the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes system, how do they meet? Well, they meet in Chicago, which is why some of the later chapters of the book are very much set there. Because a very long time ago, when Chicago had their own problems with sewage, they decided to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. So instead of the Chicago River flowing into Lake Michigan, they reversed it. And so it now flows, it was like through a series of channels at this stage, down into the Illinois River. And the Illinois River then flows past St. Louis, where it then meets up with the Mississippi River. And so what these fish have done from their ground zero, as it were, in Arkansas, is they have now spread south to Louisiana, where they threaten the Gulf Coast, but they have also made their way north. But anytime they also encounter tributary rivers like the Ohio River or the Missouri River, they're now spreading out, but they are also making their way up, so to the point where they are now have reached some of the largest man-made barriers against them in Minnesota. But they have now also reached, and in some cases passed by, some of the electric barriers in Chicago, which have now been erected to stop them. So Chicago is now essentially the front line, as it were, to use that military reference, for where it is that we're seeing a lot of the effort to stop these fish. Canada's role in an interesting way in the past couple of decades has really been to focus on the Great Lakes, to look at what we suppose the impact of these fish will be in terms of their spread if they do make it here. So we can get a sense here, again, red being bad in a nutshell, really. There's like a much higher concentration of the fish. This is, unfortunately, it's cut off here. This is year one after like a wide-scale introduction. And this is 20 years. Lake Ontario, they suspect in a lot of cases would be protected to some degree because of Niagara Falls and a lot of the hydroelectric infrastructure. It was like at Niagara Falls. That said, in the past 5 years, we have found just even here around the Toronto Islands, at least 8 to 10 grass carp that have been caught there as well. So we have found one-offs of grass carp in different parts of Lake Ontario. We have also found them in different tributaries of rivers that are heading into Lake Erie as well. We've also found them down here around Sandusky, Ohio, where they've been breeding there as well. So to wrap up, I wanted to leave you with some, perhaps, as I say, some unexpected conclusions. And basically what some issues like the climate crisis and watershed degradation, big agriculture and urban sprawl, what these issues have to do with something like Asian carp. And as I say, well, they actually have quite a lot in common, and I wanted to explain it very briefly. We know that one of the effects in the Great Lakes area, for example, one of the effects of the climate crisis is that when we're seeing rain fall in shorter periods of time. So instead of many small showers, we are seeing larger, more intense storm events. That's having a very negative effect with urban sprawl as we're paving over more areas. Cities like Chicago and Toronto, I believe to a certain extent as well, have combined sewer overflows. So when you have these big storms caused by the climate crisis falling on paved areas, you are having huge amounts of water that is flowing through as like that is contaminated in a lot of cases, is flowing into watersheds, which is then degrading the quality of those watersheds, which makes it harder in a lot of ways for native species to be able to thrive. Then you introduce something like Asian carp to that situation, and you've essentially created this perfect storm, because a lot of these effects that we're seeing, big agriculture as well. When you have those major storms as well, you have a lot of phosphorus, a lot of excess like phosphorus that's been like locked in soils throughout the Great Lakes. When you have these big storms, despite a lot of the good efforts that farmers are putting into being able to manage the phosphorus that they have on their farms, a lot of it in those big weather events ends up getting washed into local waterways. So what's the effect on local waterways then? They move whipping fast, and they are chock-a-block full of nutrients. And for Asian carp, not only is all of that nutrients providing essentially a buffet, but that high water mark is actually taken as a cue in many cases for spawning. And so what we have seen over the past few decades is that when you have this confluence of events, we have created this perfect situation for Asian carp to be able to thrive in our degraded waterways, those waterways that are being degraded through and exacerbated by the climate crisis, but also, again, through some of our legacy agricultural practices and our continuing problem with urban sprawl. So in a nutshell, there's a lot that we can do to end on a really hopeful note of some kind. It was like with regards to Asian carp. So, I mean, one of the easiest things is to be able to, anything you can think of to be able to tackle the climate crisis has this knock-on effect of being able to make the Great Lakes Basin a less hospitable place for the Asian carp that are already here and those that may come in future. Protecting our waterways, continuing with agricultural practices to be able to prevent a lot of that soil from flowing off the land in big events, so keeping that soil locked in where it's actually needed. Reducing urban sprawl, protecting the greenbelt in a lot of ways. These are things that we don't necessarily think would have an impact on Asian carp, but they do. And in the United States, one of the most effective ways that they've had of being able to keep Asian carp in check is not big technological advances or big scientific advances, though I talk about those in the book as well, but actually paying commercial fishermen to go out and do what they do, which is catch fish. So I was able to spend a few days with some of those commercial fishermen in Illinois to be able to get a sense of what the challenges are of that work, what the benefits are of it, and paying them a few $1,000s every 2 weeks to be able to go out and set nets and catch them in. They have pulled out millions and millions and millions of tons of these fish, which is why some of those big fish that we saw at the beginning are becoming increasingly hard to find, simply because you're seeing many, many small fish and a few outliers, these big fish, because suddenly there's fewer of them, so they have more resources at their disposal. So we're no longer finding a lot of those like big middle fish, 40-pounders. You're now finding a lot of smaller ones and a few outlying giant ones. And that's actually a really good sign. And it shows that these small efforts of paying commercial fishers has actually paid off in a lot of ways. So that's not necessarily something that we can do here in Canada, but that's something that has worked really, really well in the United States. But that doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels. There's obviously more for us to do. So again, there are so many different facets to this story that I would be happy to talk about. I've focused on some of these early days. The book, as it progresses, ends up talking quite an awful lot as well about everything from can we eat our way out of this problem to the threat that they pose to the Great Lakes, some of the early history with regards to why we now sell sterile grass carp throughout the United States. There's a whole certification program for sterile grass carp to be able to sell them. It's difficult with a talk like this to be able to pick and choose. I've talked at a murderous rate here now in order to be able to fit it all in because there's a lot in there. But I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about this really interesting story to find a copy of the book at your local independent store. But again, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm happy to take any questions either from people viewing at home or anyone here. Sure, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We haven't, I don't think that oh, sorry, I have to repeat the question. Have there been any Asian carp that have been found in and around the Trent Severn system? Not that I'm aware of. Largely, we have been fortunate enough that any of the fish that we have found have been one-offs. We don't believe that they're part and parcel of like a larger invasion of these fish. But I know that we have found some in Lake Erie and in Lake Ontario. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans now actually runs, and has for the past number of years, a very extensive monitoring system. They've identified, people are familiar with common carp here. They're not a native species, but they're naturalized, which I know is a problematic term. They've been here for so long that they're really acclimated to our ecosystems now. Researchers here know that anywhere where you will find common carp is the exact same kind of habitat that would be suitable to Asian carp as well. So it's entirely possible that some parts of the Trent Severn have been monitored as well, but I don't believe that they have found any there. But they do that monitoring probably about 10 months of every year or so. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what am I referring to when I say something like one-offs, and then are these fish still eaten in grocery stores? So yes, what I mean by one-offs is researchers, when they find them from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, again, I think in like September of 2016, they found, I believe, 8 or so of them at the Toronto Islands at the harbor there. And so there was this like massive federal and provincial response, sending all of these boats to be able to electroshock, to be able to see if they could find more. But they only turned up 8. Now, does anyone really believe that if you only found 8 of them, that there aren't any more in the water? Probably not. There probably are more there, but their rigorous efforts weren't able to find it. So when we say one-offs, there's the difference between, was this part of like a larger like detection of the fish, or do we have reason to believe that it was essentially someone was mistakenly using them as bait fish, for example, and then made the mistake of like dumping out all of their bait at the end of the day, thinking that they had a fish that wouldn't be problematic, but it turns out that they actually had juvenile silver carp and didn't realize it, because in those juvenile stages, silver carp and big heads are looking an awful lot like a lot of other smaller bait fish, which are capable, or which you are allowed to use. So that's what we mean by one-offs. In terms of your follow-up question, now here in Canada, you cannot buy any of those fish live to eat. You can find them here in very, very like niche Asian grocery stores. Typically would be one of the few cultures where you might find that, because it has such a lengthy like history of being consumed in some Asian cultures. But you used to be, within the past decade, you used to be able to import those fish live. And then they realized that that was a terrible idea. And so then it was changed to the fish could be packed on ice. But then the story was the US or Canadian border guards were finding this really terrifying thing where the fish, when you put them on ice, were actually able to lower their metabolism to the point where they could actually survive on ice for hours and hours and hours and then reanimate. So about a decade ago or so, the Ministry of Natural Resources here in Ontario, they were running one of their like simulations that their resource officers were running was, okay, the scenario is you have a truck that is on the 401 that is driving from Windsor to Toronto to be able to drop off a shipment of fish. The truck overturns on the highway next to a river, and you have all of these like cartons that like spill out into a stream. How would you contain that area to be able to keep those fish alive? Because we now know that if the fish were whole and seemed to be dead, even if they were on ice, we now know that they can reanimate if they haven't been out of water too long. So now the regulation is if you are importing those fish into Canada, they need to be eviscerated because they can't come back from that, basically. So you can find them to consume here. For what it's worth, there's a whole chapter later on about the economics of eating them and how that works out. Why we haven't done that in a nutshell, it's because of markets, picky preferences. They're a very bony fish, and it's very hard to remove the bones. And the typical culture in North America for many people is when they imagine eating fish in a restaurant, it's either like breaded and deep fried, or it is like a section of the fish that's being presented to them. The whole idea of like whole body, like head on bone in fish isn't really like a popular part of the fish eating culture and for many people here in North America. And so you don't have the requisite volume for eating them. You haven't really seen the interest in it. But something that I talk about as well is the fact that in America, the word subsidy is somewhat of a 4-letter word. And so you have a lot of people saying, hey, can the government subsidize us to be able to like get an industry off the ground? And then once we get people enjoying eating these things, then suddenly we won't need that money anymore. And it's slowly turning, but for a very long time, most governments said, this is an economic opportunity. And if the market will support it, then great. And if the market won't, then you're on your own. Despite the fact that the money that they could put into that would see tremendous dividends in terms of protecting the natural environment. But they were very hands-off for a very long time. Is there a way to tell the difference between common carp and Asian carp? Oh yeah, there we are up there. Yeah, so I mean, what you can kind of see, the first and most obvious thing is based on the different colors, like silvers are like very like shockingly silver. Big heads, which, oh, I turned that off. Big heads, which you can kind of see here, here, I'll turn that back on, are more like a grayish color in a lot of ways. Oh, no one at home can see that anyway. Well, for the people here. So you have the silvers down here, which are like very, very silver. Big heads are here a little bit more gray. The grass carp are a little bit greener. And black carp, you can kind of see their tail fin here. That's them up there. And they are much darker color. Common carp tend to be a tan, like a very light brown, which most of these fish are not. The other major identifying factor, which can be hard if you're not in the water, is common carp have barbels here that come out of their mouth to be able to help them sense food and taste that food. No Asian carp has barbels. As far as ones that you're looking for here, the most likely one that if you found them here in Canada, You would likely be finding grass carp in a lot of ways, which is those ones there, which I think y'all at home can maybe see that cursor. You might find silvers or big heads. The most notable thing about these is how low on the head their eyes are. Their eyes almost actually sit in a lot of ways, like right beside their mouths. Whereas I believe common carp, their eyes are a little bit higher up in order to be able to accommodate those barbels that they have, those little protrusions that stick out of their faces. Black carp, because they came so much later in the 1980s, they also have been released into open waters. They are also making their way up the Mississippi, but at a bit of a slower rate. Someone had suggested to me that if I wrote this book in 10 years, there would be a much greater emphasis on black carp, given that their preference for eating native like mollusks and snails and many like freshwater mussels in North America are some of the most endangered species that some of the most endangered freshwater species that we have in North America. Someone has, can we train black carp to eat zebra mussels? It's been suggested because in many cases, yes, they would eat those as well. You then get into the the ethics of releasing one species in order to be able to control another. But that said, there would be very little different between zebra mussels and other freshwater mussels that they might consume. So their numbers, interestingly enough, it's funny the way these things work out. This fish that is now such a problem here in North America, in their native range in China and parts of Russia, there's now so few of them that if you can find them, it's almost considered lucky. And so interestingly enough, in terms of like historic predators there, you have, because they get so big, you have to be talking about like fish or other animals that are larger than them. So I believe that in their native range, you might have been able to find like the Yangtze River dolphin at one point in time in China would have preyed on silver or bighead or grass carp. Here in North America, there was some early work looking at alligator gar. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with alligator gar. They're just these massive long fish that have these like very long like rostrums on the end of their noses as well. Very like ancient noble fish, sort of similar to sturgeon, but a slightly different body shape. They also have been known to eat in the wild. It's been recorded that they have eaten Asian carp as well in like a juvenile state. So there are some predators here, which I do talk about in the conclusion that, you know, as part of this like holistic approach to this problem, that these are the sorts of things that we can think of. Part of the reason why these fish have been able to do as well as they have is because we've treated our waterways as terribly as we have for so long in North America. And so this is one of those opportunities where cleaning up waterways, making them more habitable for native species like alligator gar, has the added benefit of also making them in a better position to help us deal with some of these fish that we have brought here. They absolutely can. There's a whole chapter on eDNA, which was one of the interesting things. Remember those early photos I showed of some of the fish when they were jumping? All of that really sort of took off at around 2009. And the reason why our current sort of modern interest in Asian carp happened was because of eDNA and some work that some people at the University of Notre Dame in Illinois were doing. Really like testing this idea of, can we do like an environmental DNA assessment? So if I go to a waterway and take a Nalgene bottle and come back with this water, can I run this through some very sophisticated technology to be able to do like a PCR analysis? And it's funny because PCR analysis is now a term that I think more people are familiar with because of COVID, but about a decade ago or so when it was first really being tested, using it for Asian carp was one of the first real ways that it proved its value as a resource tool. Because if you were curious to see, have fish been in this waterway, you would be able to go and take a water sample. You had the genetic markers for the species you were looking for, and you would be able to essentially, this is far more complicated than this, but you would be able to run the test to be able to see, this is the marker that I'm looking for. Does it show up in the same way? And if it does, it doesn't tell you anything about the prevalency. It could be that there is one fish. It could be that there's 500. it's only going to tell you has it been detected or has it not been detected. It's a light switch. It's not a dimmer switch is maybe one way of thinking about it. So the whole chapter where I talk about eDNA really stems from the fact that there was a lot of controversy surrounding this, because for a very long time, the Army Corps of Engineers, which runs the industrialized sections of the Chicago River, was telling people, Asian carp aren't this close to Chicago, don't worry about it. And then some researchers from Notre Dame over lunch said, hey, could we use this sort of like new technology to test some of that water and see? And they scooped out some of the water and they ran the tests and found that Asian carp were being detected in parts of the Chicago River that the Army Corps was telling local governments and the public that there were no fish. And so they ended up having to make this really difficult choice as scientists, which was, before their tests had been peer reviewed, is there enough public interest in this knowledge that we break the tradition of having something go through a lengthy peer review process before we make it public? And they determined that there was enough of a public value in telling people about this, that they stuck their necks out to be able to say, actually, here's what we have found. And then the ensuing controversy had them making deputations in front of Congress to essentially be able to state the veracity of their research. Some of those researchers were dragged through the mud. It became very, very ugly because the Army Corps was understandably sensitive to the fact that they were publicly, not necessarily being called liars, but that they were being refuted in this very public way. So eDNA was very controversial a decade ago. Now that the science is as sound today as it was then, it is one of many tools that resource managers here in Canada and in the United States are using very regularly to detect the presence of Asian carp. And then that sort of tells them, if they find it there, then maybe they want to go in with some of their other more thorough testing measures like electrofishing or gill nets, for example. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Yeah, the long-nosed gar. So that would be here. The alligator gar is the one I was thinking of that I know some researchers in Louisiana are working with, because they also have a problem with Asian carp down there. So my apologies. We're fortunate enough that that's not something that I think we've spent a whole lot of time focusing on here in Canada. We've spent most of our time really focusing on what their spread would be. But then some people over the past few decades have also raised some other questions, which is it, Lake Superior, for example, very deep, very cold lake, especially in the wintertime. Is it too cold there for these fish to survive? Would they find enough food to be able to survive? Unfortunately, we've found answers that aren't all that helpful to most of these questions, which is, given that their native range is in China and northern China and Russia, they're not bothered by the cold of the Great Lakes in the wintertime. And that when that time comes, they are able to move into tributaries where they are able to find more than enough food to be able to last them over the winter as well. So that's some of the research that we've done here in Canada. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and sorry, so the question was there any research done in terms of their ecological effects in their native range before they were brought over? And the interesting thing is with a lot of introduced species, it's sort of like an apples and oranges when we're comparing how they are in their native range, because they've evolved there to sort of find their space, their niche, and that's the area that they will occupy in their native range. In terms of the research that we did here, mostly we were concerned in the early days with how effective they were going to be at doing the thing we wanted them to do. So the tests or the studies that we ran in terms of the effects that they might have on, native species or phytoplankton levels or things like that, that only came after we had run all of these tests about, can we spawn them in lab? Because if we can't spawn them artificially, then who cares? But once we figured out, yes, here's how we spawn them. Okay, great. Next thing we're going to figure out is, will they actually eat the troublesome aquatic plants that we want them to? So that was the focus of all of that early research. And it was only once we figured out how to spawn them and that, yes, they would eat the plants that we wanted them to, did conservationists and biologists come in and say, well, hold on a second. What impact might they have in these tributaries of the Mississippi, or the Mississippi system, or the Gulf Coast, or the Great Lakes. That came much later. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that. I don't think there would be anything particular about Algonquin's ecosystem, for example, that would prevent them from being able to spread. The typical character trait of most invasives is that the reason that they've become so prevalent is because they're very adaptable, and they're very hardy, and they're flexible. The challenge with someone like bighead and silver carp in particular, with some other invasives, we worry that they're going to actually, like a round goby, for example, the worry is that they're going to eat sportfish eggs. So, but with silver and bighead carp, for example, we're not worried that they're going to eat native fish that we want to protect. We're worried that they're actually going to eat their lunch. And so that they will eat all of the food that native fish might necessarily be relying on, because they are such voracious consumers, and because they have adapted here to be able to eat almost anything that they find in the water column, as opposed to native fish, which evolved in these very specific ecosystems to eat certain things or at certain times or have certain preferences. Asian carp has no such fussy taste buds. Bighead and silver will eat anything, and so that's sort of the fear that we have. So I would imagine that if there were that kind of introduction, there really wouldn't be much throughout vast swaths of Ontario to be able to stop them, given how interconnected most of those waterways are. Yeah, so I spent there's a chapter in Louisiana. Sorry, the question is, what about the Gulf of Mexico? The early speculation was that these fish, they're freshwater fish, that they wouldn't be able to tolerate saltwater in any way. But if anyone knows I'm drawing the map in my head, it was like the geography of Louisiana. You have Lake Pontchartrain north of New Orleans, and it's a very brackish. It's not entirely saltwater, but it's not freshwater as well. And then on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain is another river, the Charles River. I'm not entirely sure at this point. And the early speculation was the fish were going to be coming down through the Mississippi. They'd probably make it through like the Bonacary Spillway into Lake Pontchartrain. But then they were curious to see, will we find Asian carp on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain in some of these tributary rivers? Because we know they're not coming from over here. So if they make it there, that's a long distance. And the only way that they would get from here to there would be if they were able to swim and survive in saltwater. And within a few years, they sure enough found these fish in that river on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain. So there were some biologists I spoke with who essentially suggested, like, well, what we know about like evolutionary theory is that, successive generations will adapt to these specific kinds of traits. We don't ever really expect to see Asian carp in any way like swimming freely in the Gulf of Mexico, but brackish waters where like the salt level in parts per million is tolerable, maybe they're not going to thrive there, but certainly they would thrive enough to be able to find new habitats, which we know that they've done, or that they would be able to survive there long enough to be able to breed successive generations. And they've been there long enough now that that is not such a fanciful idea, because we have actually seen it. I didn't get to spend as much time in Louisiana researching that aspect as I wanted, but there's a really fascinating history there of oil and gas companies just tearing up vast swaths of coastal wetlands, which allowed all of that salt water to seep in, which had, again, the unintended effect of creating this like perfect habitat for these fish that at the time were making their way down. And now they're there and are quite happy. Is it? Yeah, I mean, again, what I had recommended was the people's like favorite independent bookstore. What was the name you were saying of the bookstore here in Guelph? The Bookshelf? And Peter was telling me that they're doing free delivery within Guelph as well. So for anyone who was here, I had some copies with me that I would be happy to sign, but anybody who is interested in picking up a copy of the book can do it either directly through my publisher, ECW, or Bookshelf seems like the kind of store that would have it. usually are able to accommodate those requests anyway. So
So yeah, we wanted to thank Andrew for coming all the way to Toronto today to be our official launch.
I know
of the
we did it.
in-person- Yeah. I don't think the mic was working earlier, but yeah, we booked Andrew in April of 2019. All that stuff happened, but we finally got it. So thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Cheers. Okay. I'm not sure whether there's any other like closing remarks for anyone else, but thanks so much for anyone who was reading at home. I think, no, I turned that off, but you can, if you have any questions for me that we didn't end up getting to here today, I will scroll back and leave a page up for a second. Where are we? Right there. So that has my website and my email address, and that's where you can find me on Twitter. If you have any other questions about this, like feel free to drop me a line. I would be more than happy to talk with anyone who had any questions that we couldn't get here to today. So perfect. Thank you so much, everyone.